It's time. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome in another episode of the Front Office Podcast. I'm your host, Pistols. Today, we continue on with our philosophy series and how to think and how to draft better. Preparing now will make draft day so much easier in the long run. Just getting everything in order and the way that you think about how everything kind of works in real time is only beneficial to draft day and the way that you should go about thinking about it. Today's episode, we are going over how to read the board, how to read your draft board and how to identify positional runs and value pockets, and focusing on the tiers instead of just looking at a ranking list and drafting based off of that because you think that's the next guy that should be drafted. Most of the time, fantasy football is one of those things. Yes, you're drafting players, right? You draft your guys that you think are going to help you win your championship in your season. But whether you realize it or not, you draft based on the way the board falls, not any sort of ranking system or anything like that. So the idea is because every pick changes the value. Every decision will shift the board, and if you're not reacting to it, you're drafting behind. You have to be able to adapt and react to what's happening in front of you, and that's kind of the reason for today's episode. We are on episode 15. We're rolling right along. I know we're still early on and we're in April and we are coming up on the draft this month. So, we're going to watch how the draft is going to shift offenses and schemes and opportunity for certain players. Plans, if you go in with a plan, it's a lot easier to pivot and make the next pick mean everything. Values change instantly from round 1 all the way down to round 15, 16, 17, however many rounds are in your league. It's just one of those things that if you don't react to it in time, that causes chaos and panic, and that's never a good sign for draft day. Like I said, from right from the first round, if you're sitting at 5 or 6 and you're waiting for a guy to drop to you and he doesn't drop to you, and now you have to figure out who to pick next. So chaos can ensue in your draft as early as round 1. But here's the thing. We're not drafting in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is managers will walk in with a list of players that they want. They go by this list, they create this list, and this is how their draft has to pan out. It has to go exactly according to plan, and a lot of the times it doesn't. The problem is that the list becomes irrelevant almost immediately. Like I said, from round 1, if you have CeeDee Lamb and your first wide receiver taken and he goes a couple picks before you, now what? Now you panic. Now you pick the next guy. You're just basing your picks off of chaos and what the jumble mindset that goes through your head when you're sitting there in round 1 going, that was my guy. Now what? The board constantly changes. It changes pick to pick, not even round to round, pick to pick. Every single pick, it creates new value on the board. Like I said, plans break early. Like I can't tell you how many times that I've been sitting in the middle of the first round going, oh, this guy should fall to me. And then somehow, some way the draft changes and everything completely shifts all the way through the rest of the draft. And then it's just madness and infuriating. You leave the draft feeling defeated already, and the season hasn't even started yet. Having a solid foundation on how you want your roster to be built guys that you have no problem taking, from round to round. The way that I go about my draft is I have a list, and I have a tier list that I create. Okay, these are my round one guys. Who am I who do I want to take here if this doesn't work out the way it's supposed to? I go into round two. Okay, these are my round two guys. These are the guys that I'm seeing on the board. What happens if one of these guys doesn't make it to me? Am I okay with drafting said player or this player or that player, or however you want to manage it? But if you come in with a list and you stick to it, chances are your team is not going to look like the list that you put together. Which brings up my next point. Tiers create clarity. When you create a tier list, tier 1, tier 2, or S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier, however you want to break it down, whatever's easier for you to follow. Tiers are much better than rankings. There's a lot of guys that fall into certain categories of player. You have your elite players, your guys that are just basically, wide receivers that are uncoverable and are going to get, 100 yards every game and produce massive fantasy points. Your running backs who carry the ball 25 plus times are going to produce. Wow, they're hard today apparently. Produce points on a regular basis. Quarterbacks who are just gunslingers that you're guaranteed, 300-400 yards a game. So these are all different tiers of players. When you have them in a rankings kind of jumble up everything together. Now I know you can separate it based on quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and all that, but it still just generates a list for you, right? So you go from 1 to the top 40 wide receivers in the league, top 50 running backs in the league, top 32 quarterbacks in the league, and you base your judgments on that list. And then the minute that list goes, the minute the guy gets taken, all chaos breaks out. All hell breaks loose. The draft is completely ruined. When you create a tier list, as I was saying, you get this. For me, I get this calmness that comes over me during draft day, because draft day can be very stressful. Of course, we all play for money. So the idea is obviously to win the league. But when you create a tier, that really shows you how your decision making comes into play when everything does just go off the rails. When drop offs happen, as far as okay, we're in the first round. These are my first round guys. Round 2. These are my round 2 guys. Now my drop off is here in round 3. When guys start running off the board, that's kind of how it filters down. And when you have a tier list as opposed to just a simple ranking list, it just makes it much more simpler and easier to adapt and react to the rest of the draft and how everything else is falling into place. There's a pretty big drop off at the running back situation. We'll even take it a step further, even though I think they're irrelevant. The tight end position has a massive drop off. There's only a couple guys in the top tier list. We're talking about guys like Brock Bowers. I would put Tyler Warren up there. Is probably he had a really good season, and looking for Daniel Jones to come back. I can't even think off the top of my head because who does research. But for the most part, there's a pretty big drop off when it comes to talent and it comes to fantasy production in the tight end position. And every position has a drop off. It's just because there's so many wide receivers and there's so many running backs in the league, it's a little bit later that drop off. But as far as the tight end position goes, a lot of the times you see that drop off really early. You got Trey McBride, Brock Bowers, Tyler Warren. Those kind of guys are in that first tier of tight ends. And once those guys are gone, that skill gap is really, really large. Then we're looking at mid to late round guys that, you're not even guaranteed to draft any of them. So moving on to the next point, talking about tight ends, identifying runs. Runs are super predictable. And what I mean by a run is when a guy, when somebody starts to take a running back, then you see a whole consecutive picks of running backs going. And somebody takes a wide receiver, and then wide receivers go. And then when people start taking quarterbacks, then you start to see the quarterbacks fall off, and then tight ends. So that's a run in fantasy football. When you see that, it's really important to identify when that's happening and to react to it. Otherwise, it could be too late, especially at the tight end position. And I'm going to bring up the tight ends a lot because the drop off in tight end is so large that when people start taking the top tier tight ends, sometimes people tend to panic a little bit, and they have to, they need the next tight end and the next tight end and the next tight end. Otherwise, you're just going to be left with, a tight end from a team that really doesn't utilize the position all that much. And then you're kind of just sitting there with a guy that sits on your roster with a very, very low floor, 5 to 8 points, when really you want a guy that can get you 10 to 15 points in the tight end position. Once, if you react too late to it, again, quarterback is a little different when it comes to identifying the run, because a lot of people will draft a quarterback very early. I'm just not one of those people. I don't like to take a quarterback earlier than round 10. I know my value of guys that I have available at that point. A lot of people don't take a backup tight end until later in the draft, you would think. But a lot of people like to go after Josh Allen first, and Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson, and we see these guys kind of go in the first 3 rounds. That once those guys start going, then it creates a run of quarterbacks. So in my tier list, being able to react to that later on is much more comfortable for me. And I know everybody's different, and I know everybody drafts different, but hopefully this can give you kind of a little bit of an insight to what goes on real time, live, when you're sitting there drafting in front of your computers or phones or tablets or whatever you use to draft. In the QB scenario, there's 32 starting quarterbacks in the NFL. They all have to throw the ball to somebody. Now, again, the tier list helps you identify which ones are going to score a lot of points, throw the ball a lot, depending on the offense and the scheme and how everything fits together. But this kind of segues into my next point, which is identifying the value pockets. Now, every draft has value pockets. Now, these are guys where they might fall a little bit further than you expect. Maybe if you're looking at a guy in the 3rd or 4th round and he still doesn't get picked, then you're kind of like, okay, this guy probably should have been here. Maybe I'm getting a pretty good steal on this type of player. A lot of the times where positions are ignored, usually in the first 3 rounds, it depends on if you get guys that are really wide receiver heavy, really running back heavy, or kind of have a mix of everything. The guys that draft before you, if you see a guy take 3 running backs in the first 3 rounds, you know that you probably have a better wide receiving core than he does, because if you identify that that's what he's doing, then you can kind of take those higher tiered wide receivers. But the biggest value for me, the biggest value pocket is created at the wide receiver position, because there's so many wide receivers in the league. Every team has at least 7 wide receivers on the field. Not all at the same time, but on the sideline, they sub in, they sub out, and there's guys that are constantly rotating in. When you really only have maybe 1 or 2 guys that rotate in the running back position, obviously you only have 1 quarterback on the field at all times. And then the tight end position just kind of acts as another wide receiver. Most teams don't have too many dressed. So it's one of those things where if you can identify a value pocket, whether it be a guy that should have gone earlier that you're kind of getting later, or if it's a guy that, you thought that really maybe should have been drafted later and somebody takes him sooner, then you can kind of adjust from there and maybe pick somebody that he should have probably picked in the first place, right? So if you identify that value pocket, especially at the wide receiver position, because there's so many wide receivers in the league that get drafted in fantasy football. I know a lot of roster limits allow like 6 or 7 wide receivers for that position. So you can end up having a roster with 6 or 7 wide receivers on your 2 starters and a flex maybe, and then the rest are on your bench for depth. But for the most part, identifying that value pocket really kind of helps keep your tiers in order. It helps keep you grounded during draft day and when you're on the clock and you're not going into that panic mode. Especially, I'm a big proponent of, if I draft a wide receiver, I try to get the quarterback that throws them the ball. I don't know why I do that. It's just a thing that I've always done. If I take Amon-Ra St. Brown in the first round, later on I'll try and get Jared Goff from the Lions there to kind of double or triple the points that you can earn there. But recognizing the value pockets and guys that are sitting there on the board waiting, that you're kind of feeling out, that should have been drafted sooner. You kind of create that value for yourself in a depth position, to where, hey, this guy should have went in the 3rd round. I got him in the 5th round. I feel pretty good about that. Again, and then the last part of being able to read the board is having flexibility. Flexibility is your leverage. You can take advantage of everything that's happening if you're flexible. If you're okay with not getting the players on your list, which you should be okay with not getting the players on your list. There's plenty of guys in the league that need to be drafted and need to have a roster spot in every single league, and you're going to see those constantly throughout the fantasy football season. Once we get kind of closer to it and once it starts rolling out. But if you're rigid and you stick to that plan, you're just going to miss it. You're not going to be very flexible. You're going to draft, not having that flexibility. If you have flexibility, it turns all that chaos into opportunity. And having a pivot plan to that tier list, tying everything back in together, having that tier list, having a solid plan, being flexible on draft day is only going to make it easier when you come into draft season. And when you're looking at the board going, okay, this is how I want to structure my roster. As long as I can structure it this way, I'm going to be okay. And as I said in the last episode, your draft is just creating leverage and opportunity in different ways. Drafting for you have your roster, but it's your waiver moves, it's your trades, and everything else that comes after draft day that is going to help you win your league. So don't get sucked into drafting the players. Draft the board. Draft how the board is falling. Draft the way that that you're seeing the board shift and the value pocket shift. If you can manage that, then if you can understand how it moves, you'll always have an advantage over everybody in your league. So, having, again, the top points it comes down to: have the flexibility, create a tier list, draft for leverage. All those things will make draft day and your fantasy season so much simpler. We prepare now, we win later. That's what it's all about. Looking in the off season, creating those tier lists, especially after the draft. In a couple weeks here, we're going to see new guys going to new teams and see how they're going to fit into their new schemes. If there's any opportunity there, whose place are they taking, where the opportunity grows for each player. But But I appreciate you guys for being here for this episode of the Front Office Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Pistols. Appreciate you. Thank you.